The door didn't creak. It gave way softly, the same way her trust had. Quiet, almost respectful. Selene hadn't planned to come home early. Brunch with Imani had ended with a strange weight in her chest, something that tasted like instinct and ache. So she turned the driver around without saying much. Not because she knew, but because she'd started to feel invisible. And when a woman feels unseen, she starts seeing everything. She stepped into the silence of the house, expecting emptiness. Caius was supposed to be in San Francisco. That's what he said, at least. But his coat, his favorite black wool one, was still hanging in the foyer, untouched. A coat he never left behind. Still, Selene didn't run. She didn't call out. She moved through the corridor like someone returning to an old, unfinished painting. Her heels barely made a sound on the marble floor. She paused outside the study. Their study. His voice, low, amused, drifted through the partially closed door. A woman's laugh followed, not hers. She pushed the door fully open, not forcefully, just enough. Enough to see. Caius was standing too close. Jelena, the secretary she'd once called grateful and grounded, was whispering something with her fingers grazing his chest. Solene's breath stopped. Her body didn't move. The heat rushed to her ears, but she stayed quiet. Caius tilted his head down. Jelena tilted hers up. Their mouths met in a kiss that wasn't hurried. It was deliberate. Selene stood there. 1 second, 2, 3, no scream, no broken glass, no shouting match. Just her, frozen in place, absorbing it fully. Her hand let go of the door. Her heart didn't race, it steadied, and then she turned away. The hallway didn't echo as Selene backed out. The walls of the house, once filled with music and ambition, felt muted now, like they too had been holding their breath. The sunlight cut across the marble floor in sharp, golden lines, striking the threshold of the study like a quiet warning. Dust floated in the air, catching the light, slow and unbothered, as if time had stretched just for her to witness this moment. Her hand was still trembling, though she refused to look down at it. Instead, she focused on not breaking the silence. Her heel pressed slightly into the edge of the Persian rug by the study door, grounding her. It was the same rug she had helped Caius pick out during their first year of marriage. She remembered the way they'd argued, playfully, over patterns and price. He'd kissed her in that same spot once, right after teasing her about her artsy taste. Now, she shifted her weight, stepped off the rug, and walked backward like she was exiting a crime scene. A quiet one. One where the killer was someone she used to love. No drama, no confrontation, just the deliberate withdrawal of a woman who had seen too much to stay, too much to pretend she hadn't. She walked past the coat again, still hanging, still lying. Selene didn't collapse on the stairs or curl into a sob in the bathroom. She didn't speedial Imani or throw open the doors to demand explanations. No. She walked upstairs slowly, silently, her mind not yet screaming, her face still composed. Inside their bedroom, the one with the glass balcony and the untouched row of designer dresses, she sat on the edge of the bed, still holding her purse. For a long while, she didn't move. Her breathing returned to normal. Her hands steadied. She wasn't falling apart. She was waking up. She rose, opened the drawer beside the bed, and pulled out a small leather notebook. The same one she used to jot down passwords, gallery contacts, and, more recently, private access. Codes to Caius's servers, the ones she helped set up when she used to believe in his vision. The same ones he thought she'd forgotten. She didn't cry as she opened her laptop. She logged in. The files she found didn't surprise her. The emails weren't all about Jelena. What she did next, quietly, methodically, wasn't about heartbreak. It was about precision, because if Caius had made her feel invisible, he was about to see her in headlines. Caius Aurelian wasn't just a man with money. He was a man with influence, the kind of influence that didn't just buy things, but bent policies, silenced scandals, and maneuvered headlines. People envied his power, but very few understood how he built it. Even fewer knew the shortcuts he took to keep it. But Selene did. She wasn't just the woman beside him in photos. Before the yacht parties and charity galas, she was the one who helped structure his first investor deck. She edited pitch decks late into the night, labeled folders, designed strategy binders, organized receipts for shell donations. Back when it was just him, a dream, and a woman who believed too much. She'd seen it all. Unregistered subsidiaries used to launder funds through fake non-profits NDAs issued, like candy to dismissed whistleblowers, overseas accounts that didn't match reported revenues. She hadn't asked questions then, thinking it was temporary, or maybe necessary. But now she realized the empire she helped build was designed to protect him, not them. And she had the keys, the server logs, the signed memos, the documents they both filed late into the night. Only this time, she wasn't filing them away. She was gathering receipts. Because sometimes the only thing stronger than heartbreak is clarity. Selene wasn't impulsive. She never had been. Even in love, she measured things, gestures, intentions, long-term impact. It was part of what made her such an effective partner in Caius's early rise. She thought before acting. But that didn't mean she lacked fire. It meant when she moved, it mattered. That evening, as dusk bled into the edges of the sky, she closed the laptop. She had everything she needed, not for revenge, but for truth. The plan began quietly, with a call to Imani. Imani Nier wasn't just her best friend. She was also one of the most respected investigative journalists in the Northeast. Fierce, credible, trusted. The kind of woman who wouldn't run a headline unless the facts could bury the defense. Selene didn't ask Imani to publish anything, at least not yet. She simply asked her to look, to review the documents, to cross-check dates, numbers, signatures. "Just tell me," Selene said, her voice calm but unshakable, "if I'm crazy, or if I've been helping him cover a kingdom built on lies." Imani didn't answer right away. She didn't have to. Selene's plan wasn't born from vengeance. It was born from accountability. Caius had used her loyalty as cover. Now, she would use his confidence as evidence. And while the world still thought she was just a silent wife in the shadows, she was already lighting the match. At first, Selene had no interest in anyone noticing her, much less comforting her. The last thing she needed was pity disguised as politeness. She wasn't shattered. She was sharpening, but fate has a strange rhythm. The night after her quiet call with Imani, a name she hadn't heard in years appeared in her inbox, Elion Trescott. No subject line, just a single message. "Strength looks good on you, but I remember when your smile was softer. If you ever want to talk about art again, I'm here." Elion wasn't a stranger. He was a quiet thread from her past, an investor and collector who had once sponsored one of her earliest exhibits. He never hovered, never crossed lines, just watched her work with the kind of interest that didn't ask for anything in return. He wasn't flashy like Caius. He didn't command rooms with arrogance, but he saw things, not the kind that spark headlines, but the kind that heal. At first, she ignored the message. Then, 3 days later, she replied. One coffee, no interviews, no questions. She didn't know what would come of it. She wasn't looking for anything more than quiet. But what began as one conversation would soon stretch into 2. Then, a walk. Then silence that didn't feel empty. While the headlines would shout about betrayal and empire collapse, he would be the one who reminded her that love didn't always enter with noise. Sometimes, it returns through stillness. Long before Selene became a wife with a high-rise address and a driver who waited with the engine running, she was a girl surrounded by unfinished canvases and the smell of turpentine. Her parents weren't wealthy, but they were rich in vision. Her mother, a sculptor whose hands never stopped moving, and her father, a street muralist who believed blank walls were invitations. Their home was small but alive. Music floated between rooms, and light filtered through mismatched curtains. The kitchen table doubled as a workspace for sketches and collages. They didn't believe in luxury, they believed in legacy. Selene learned to question what people showed and look for what they hid, the raw, the flawed, the honest. That's where beauty lived. She grew up believing the world could be shaped by color and story, not cash. She wore second-hand boots with pride and carried sketchbooks like diaries. Her sense of worth was never tied to appearance, but to purpose. By the time she turned 26, Selene had curated her first major solo exhibit, a delicate fusion of visual art and spoken word, themed around the idea of being seen beneath the surface. It was her most personal work, filled with pain and vulnerability she rarely shared aloud. She hadn't done it for praise. She'd done it to breathe. That's the night he saw her. Not the crowd, not the reviews, not the buzz around her name. Caius Aurelian stood across the room, staring not at her, but at her centerpiece, a melted glass sculpture titled Threshold. Later, she'd remember how quiet he was, how he didn't compliment her dress or her smile. He just said, "You made that pain beautiful." That was the beginning, or what she thought was. There were always people at gallery events who spoke too loudly and laughed too long, men who praised the lighting more than the art, women who complimented you just to be photographed doing so. But that night, Caius was different. He didn't orbit. He observed. He stood in front of Threshold for nearly 10 minutes. Selene watched him from a distance, expecting the usual, a rich man intrigued. Maybe hoping for a conversation that led to flattery or a checkbook. But Caius didn't move like that. When he finally turned, he didn't approach her like a collector or a fan. He introduced himself by name, with no mention of what he owned or who he knew. He asked only one question. What made you choose glass over steel? It was such an intentional question. Not about color, not about technique, but about vulnerability. Selena smiled for real that night. Because glass can break and still catch light, she answered. Their first real conversation didn't happen on couches or between wine tastings. It happened standing beside art that exposed her, art he didn't reduce to decoration. Caius didn't compliment her appearance until days later. Instead, he asked for her old portfolios, visited her studio without cameras, and helped carry supplies when her hand cramped from overworking. He wasn't trying to possess her. At least not then. He was trying to understand her. And that's how it started, not with diamonds, but with questions. Not with attention, but with interest. They began to meet outside the spotlight, early morning coffees at quiet cafes, long walks through back streets near abandoned galleries. He once said, "You remind me of things I forgot mattered." It was easy to fall into something that felt like more than love. It felt like recognition, herself wrapped in moments that blurred the line between reality and some beautiful illusion. They wandered through empty art studios after hours, flicking on dusty lights just to stand in the quiet together. He'd listen to her explain brushstrokes and texture like it was gospel, never interrupting, just watching her with that unblinking gaze. When she spoke, about light theory or the ache behind abstract forms, he didn't just hear her, he absorbed it. Their first kiss didn't happen on a yacht or at a penthouse party. It happened in a converted loft space with exposed brick and a half-finished mural behind them. They had just finished setting up one of Solene's pieces for a private collector. She was barefoot, covered in specks of gold dust from the metallic paints. He leaned against the far wall, his shirt rolled to the elbows, sleeves stained from lifting panels. She said something about how tired her back was, half laughing, stretching her arms above her head. He crossed the room slowly. No grand gesture, no rehearsed line, just a pause, his hand reaching up to brush the flecks from her cheek, and a kiss that didn't ask for permission, but offered presence. Under the glow of a golden studio light, they didn't speak. Not after, not for minutes. It wasn't passion for show. It was the kind of quiet that made a woman feel chosen. By the third month, they were inseparable. Caius began bringing her into private meetings, encouraging her voice. When reporters asked about his sudden shift into philanthropic work, he simply said, "I met someone who reminded me to care." Selene thought she'd found a partner, not just a lover. And for a while, she did. Selene had always been fiercely independent. She never saw her art as a stepping stone to wealth or a passport to someone else's world. But when Caius began expanding his venture into global sustainability tech, an empire promising to merge ethics with innovation, he didn't ask her to step away from her work. He asked her to help shape his. "It's not just code or capital," he told her once, pacing their kitchen at midnight, papers in hand. "I want the soul of this company to be about meaning, about people. You see that better than anyone." At first, she resisted. Art was her home, her grounding. But Caius made her feel needed in ways that weren't just romantic, they were strategic. He wasn't asking her to be a trophy. He was asking her to be a compass. So, 6 weeks later, Celine submitted her final resignation to the gallery she'd called home for 5 years. She didn't cry. She told herself it was the start of something larger. They converted one floor of their new Manhattan home into a shared office. She curated the branding language, the public image. She sat in on meetings, rewrote donor speeches, coached him through investor dinners. Caius would turn to her during presentations, saying, "Celine wrote that part," like it was a badge of honor. "We're building something together," she reminded herself when the hours stretched long and her art supplies gathered dust. But over time, those words began to echo differently. "We, together." Words that once felt powerful started to sound like compromises, little cuts hidden behind shared ambition. She began noticing the shift before she admitted it. A shorter thank you after meetings, fewer glances across the table, nights when he said, "I'll be late," but didn't explain why. It wasn't just the company that was expanding. The distance between them was too. The change wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself with slammed doors or shouting matches. It began in silence, Caius forgetting small things that once mattered. He'd skip the morning coffee they always shared. He'd stop asking about her reading list, stop listening when she tried to share her thoughts on a new exhibit she wanted to curate on the side. At first, Celine brushed it off. Busy quarter, investor pressure, growth fatigue. These were reasonable justifications. She told herself, love sometimes bends under the weight of ambition. She told herself he was trying in his way. But things shifted further. He stopped texting back during the day. Phone calls ended faster. "Can we talk later?" became a script. When they did speak, his tone had changed. Not cruel, not sharp, just flat, like she was a meeting he hadn't scheduled for. One night, she lit candles in the dining room, his favorite wine already breathing, a slow-cooked dish waiting to be served. He didn't show. At 11:52 p.m., he walked in, loosened his tie, and mumbled, "You didn't have to wait up." She smiled through it. "We haven't eaten together in weeks." "I told you this week would be heavy," he said, removing his blazer like a man shedding a burden. "Don't make it a thing." It wasn't the words. It was the weight behind them, the subtle implication that her longing was inconvenient. She began to shrink her expectations, folding them smaller each time he returned late. She stopped asking if he needed company at events. She stopped planning meals. She told herself this was a phase. But beneath her restraint, something pressed against her ribs, a growing discomfort that whispered, he's already started leaving. He just hasn't packed yet. Imani never danced around a truth, not in print and definitely not in friendship. She had known Celine since university, back when they shared a campus cafe table and borrowed each other's scarves. Imani had the kind of brain that cut through clutter and a mouth that didn't ask for permission before speaking facts. They met for brunch at a tucked-away bistro in the West Village, the kind of place they used to visit often, before Celine's calendar became entangled in quarterly projections and gala committees. Imani stirred her coffee once, twice, then leaned back. "So, where's Loverboy this morning? Saving the planet or saving face?" Selene offered a light laugh, but it didn't reach her eyes. "He's traveling a lot, long days, meetings, mostly." "Right." Imani's gaze didn't waver. "You've said that 3 brunches in a row." Selene reached for her mimosa, her hand too still. "I'm not paranoid, if that's what you're getting at. Did I say you were?" Imani tilted her head. "But since we're here, let me ask the question that's been choking me for weeks. When was the last time you felt like his wife, not his business partner. That one landed. Solene's lips parted slightly, but no words followed. She looked out the window instead. "I'm not trying to start anything," Imani continued, her voice gentler now. I remember how your face used to light up when you talked about him. These days, you're defending him like a press release." Solene didn't respond. She didn't need to, because the silence between her and Imani said more than a denial ever could. Later that afternoon, Imani texted her a single line, "If your gut's talking, don't make it whisper." Solene stared at the message longer than she should have. It happened on a Tuesday, an ordinary day made unforgettable by something seemingly small. Solene had gone into Caius's closet, not out of suspicion, but necessity. The dry-cleaning van had arrived early, and he'd left in a rush. She was gathering his usual pieces, his navy suits, the white button-downs he rotated like clockwork, when her hand brushed against a small folded slip wedged between hangers. A receipt, not from one of their usual tailors or designers. It was from Linney and Wild, a luxury boutique she'd never heard of until that moment. The purchase listed a silk blouse, color Merlot, and a designer fragrance labeled Rouge Délicieuse, the kind of scent with staying power, the kind of scent that lingers on a collar. Her stomach tightened. She placed the receipt on the dresser, unsure what to do with it. Part of her wanted to believe it was a gift for her, maybe something planned, delayed, hidden for surprise. But Caius hadn't given her a gift in weeks, maybe months. She picked up his blazer from the back of the chair, brought it close, and there it was, that subtle, unfamiliar scent. Not her perfume, not anything they'd shared, a rich, sweet floral with undertones of spice, feminine and deliberate. It clung to the fabric like a fingerprint. She froze, inhaling once more, as if the proof could vanish if she didn't breathe it in again. But it didn't vanish. It clung. A moment later, she folded the receipt, slipped it into her own coat pocket, and left the room. She said nothing when he got home, nothing when they went to bed, nothing the next morning. But her silence wasn't passive. It was gathering weight. Because now she had something to trace. And the scent on his jacket wasn't just from another woman. It was from a moment she hadn't been invited to. By Friday, the distance between them had grown from quiet evenings to full days of avoidance. Caius barely looked up from his phone during breakfast. Solene, calm on the outside, had mastered the art of watching without reacting. That morning, he stood by the kitchen island, tapping through emails. "I'm heading to San Francisco later," he said casually, sipping his espresso. "Last-minute meeting. I'll be gone 2 nights." She nodded once, her voice neutral. "Didn't see it on the calendar. Didn't have time to update it," he replied without looking up. "I'll send the details to Marina." He kissed her cheek, barely, and left the room. No suitcase, no warmth, just absence in motion. Solene waited until the front door clicked shut before moving. She walked slowly to the foyer, to the row of coats they kept near the entry, and there it was. His favorite one. The tailored black wool coat he always wore to business flights, the one he claimed he'd packed for San Francisco, still hanging, undisturbed. She stared at it for a long time. Her hand reached out, gently brushing the sleeve. Not packed, not forgotten, still here. She didn't panic. She didn't call. She didn't accuse. Instead, she walked to her room, sat at her vanity, and stared into the mirror, not at her reflection, but at the woman behind her eyes, the one who had spent years choosing partnership over pride, who had muted her instincts for the sake of peace. But peace shouldn't come at the cost of truth. By evening, she would be standing in the doorway of their shared study, witnessing a kiss meant to be hidden. And this moment, the coat left behind, this was the first thread in the story she was about to rewrite. The silence was loudest when it had company. Solene stood just beyond the threshold, her hand still on the doorframe. Body still in the house she called home, but mind miles away. It should have felt like impact, like glass shattering against stone. But it didn't. It felt quiet, still, as if time had offered her a courtesy pause to examine what she was about to become. On the other side of the study, Caius leaned into Jelena like gravity had pulled him there. Her voice, a soft, practiced hum, curled around his name. The way her hand rested against his chest wasn't accidental. It was familiar. They kissed, slowly, boldly. The kind of kiss you don't give unless you've given it before. Celine didn't gasp. Her chest didn't heave. Her knees didn't buckle. She watched with a strange clarity, a stillness that bordered on power. It wasn't denial. It was comprehension. Sharp and full. There was no cinematic fury, no broken picture frames, no shouting of names that didn't deserve to echo in pain. Just breath, steady, deliberate, and a mental step back, not away from him, away from the illusion. She realized in that moment that her grief had started long before this scene. It had begun with the forgotten dinners, the coat left behind, the scent on collars. The infidelity wasn't the betrayal, it was the confirmation, and that made all the difference. Her fingers released the doorframe gently, like letting go of something she'd held too tightly for too long. There were tears building. Of course there were. But they stayed where they were, suspended, like decisions not yet made. Her face didn't crack. It set, not in bitterness, but in resolution. Not every woman needs to scream to be heard. Some just need to watch long enough to see the truth, then walk away with all their dignity intact. She stepped back, one heel first, then the other. The study door remained open behind her, framing a moment that would never be, forgotten but would never be spoken of. Not on that night, not in that house. As Celine moved down the hallway, her footsteps made no sound. There was no slammed door, no shouted question. She didn't demand an explanation because some betrayals explain themselves. She passed the vase on the console table, a gift from Caius on their 2nd anniversary. It once held sunflowers. Now it was empty. Like so many things in their home, symbolic, polished but hollow. At the base of the stairs, she paused and glanced back. The light from the study spilled into the corridor, spilling over the hardwood. Floors like it had done so many nights when they worked late together. Except this time, it was someone else's laugh echoing into the hallway. She turned away. With each step up the stairs, she felt lighter, not free, but looser, like a knot beginning to untangle. She didn't want to hear his voice calling after her. She didn't want to give him the power of reaction. Her silence wasn't retreat, it was control. She entered their bedroom and shut the door behind her. Not locked, just closed. Inside, she moved through the room like a guest, taking note of how little of herself remained. His watch charger on the nightstand, his cufflinks on the dresser, the framed photograph by the bed, an older version of them, laughing, champagne in hand. She picked it up and turned it face down. In the mirror, she caught her own reflection, not weeping, not broken, just quiet, just ready. It wasn't running, it was reclaiming. She wouldn't burn the house down tonight. She would wait for daylight. Because when she left next, she wouldn't just leave a room. She'd leave a man unprepared for the silence she was about to make very, very loud. Celine didn't sleep that night, not because her mind raced, but because it settled. Lying on the edge of the bed, she stared at the ceiling as dawn crept closer. Not replaying the image from the study, but examining everything around it. The years of shrinking, the careful way she'd edited herself to keep the peace. The version of herself she'd become, polished, agreeable, always adjusting her reflection to flatter the man beside her. She had been his mirror. When he was confident, she reflected belief. When he was ambitious, she reflected loyalty. When he was cruel in subtle ways, she reflected patience. And in doing so, she had disappeared. The realization wasn't angry. It was clean, surgical. It landed with clarity rather than collapse. She understood now that she hadn't lost him in that study. She'd lost herself long before. And that was the greater theft. Celine sat up, feet touching the floor, grounding herself. She walked to the window and watched the city wake. Cars moved. Lights flickered on. Life continued. It always did. And for the first time in a long while, she felt aligned with that movement, instead of trapped inside it. She whispered it aloud, not for him, not for the walls, but for herself. I'm done playing his mirror. The words didn't shake. They didn't need to. It's time he sees his reflection. She wouldn't expose him in rage. She wouldn't beg him for truth. She wouldn't perform pain for sympathy. What she was about to do would be deliberate, quiet, exact, because mirrors show what people want to see. Reflections show what is. And soon, Caius Aurelian would be forced to face his, without her standing beside him to soften the image. Selene turned away from the window, already moving toward the next version of herself. Not a wife in waiting, but a woman in control of the narrative. It took Selene 2 full days to make the call, not because she hesitated, but because she wanted to be certain. Certain she wasn't acting from emotion. Certain she could look herself in the mirror afterward. Certain that this wasn't just about betrayal but accountability. When she finally called Imani, it wasn't dramatic. No heavy breath. No cryptic setup. Just a calm, quiet statement. I have something, and I need you to see it. Imani didn't ask questions. She only replied, "Come." Selene arrived at Imani's apartment with a leather-bound folio, an external drive, and a small zippered pouch. These weren't things she collected recently. These were documents she had once considered harmless. Business drafts, proof of company growth, correspondence. She helped organize when the team was still lean, and Caius trusted her with everything. They sat cross-legged on the living room rug, coffee cooling beside them, as Selene began laying out the pieces. Email chains from 3 years ago, ones she'd saved out of habit, showing inflated expense. Reports tied to charitable donations that never reached their destinations. Contracts with consulting firms that were just names on paper, approved and signed by people who, in hindsight, had never appeared at a single board meeting. I archived these when I still believed in what we were doing, Selene murmured, watching Imani scroll through the files. And now? Imani asked, eyes scanning a PDF filled with tax summaries. Now I believe people deserve to know who they're cheering for. There was no adrenaline, no plotting, just evidence, truth, and a sense of duty that came from clarity. By midnight, Imani leaned back, eyebrows lifted. Selene, this isn't just about a bad marriage. This is federal. I know. So, what do you want to do with it? Selene didn't flinch. Let the truth speak. The deeper they looked, the darker the patterns became. Imani leaned into the screen, her fingers flying over the trackpad, opening one file after another while Selene organized printed papers into categories on the floor: financials, non-profit reports, overseas invoices. It was overwhelming at first, a mess of numbers, corporate language, and vague names. But as they layered old conversations with new discoveries, a web began to take shape. It started with the fake non-profit. Selene had once drafted the public-facing proposal for it, a relief initiative tied to eco-housing in conflict zones. The website was glossy. The mission statement had been hers. But the donation trail stopped abruptly. The listed partnerships didn't match actual vendors. And the supposed on-ground team? Non-existent. That's laundering, Imani said flatly, using a humanitarian front to shift funds. Next came the contractor scam. Payments made to a shell company under the name Delacour Holdings, signed off by Caius and another executive Selene didn't recognize. The wire transfers originated from one of the accounts she used to help balance during quarterly reviews. She remembered asking about a discrepancy once. Caius had said it was temporary routing. She hadn't pressed. Now she saw the truth. It was never temporary. It was deliberate. Then came the labor violations. Subcontractor lists for overseas manufacturers revealed discrepancies in labor costs and signed affidavits that didn't match standard protocols. Workers were reportedly paid, but the signatures had been copied across documents, identical stroke for stroke. Selene stared at a file, her stomach twisting. These aren't just shady, they're criminal. Imani looked at her. He built a kingdom on sand and used your handwriting to pave the road. Selene didn't blink. I helped him build the mask, she said softly. Now I'll help take it off. They weren't just connecting dots. They were outlining a case the world had yet to see. The first file went out at 6:42 a.m. on a Thursday. Imani uploaded a redacted version of the non-profit documents to a secure Anonymous portal used by investigative journalists and whistleblowers. No names, no context, just enough financial inconsistencies to raise eyebrows in the right circles. Selene watched the screen as Imani hit send. Her pulse didn't race. This wasn't retaliation. This was revelation. By the end of that day, one of Imani's trusted contacts in the International Finance Bureau picked up the file. Quietly, carefully, they began asking questions behind closed doors. Where did the money go? Why did the paper trail vanish halfway through the fiscal year? Selene didn't speak to Caius that day. She didn't need to. She knew the wave was starting to build. 2 days later, the shell company files followed. Another upload. Another anonymous source. Then came the emails. The screenshots of internal conversations showing executives skirting donation caps, referencing fictitious partnerships. Selene blurred her name, but left enough visible that any forensic team could trace the patterns. She wasn't hiding because she was scared. She was hiding because timing mattered. The truth had to unfold before anyone could contain it. And it did. A tweet from a small, well-respected activist group shared a screenshot from the leak, captioned, "Are we funding impact or illusion? Someone should ask Caius Aurelian's board." The tweet gained traction in minutes. By noon, finance bloggers picked it up. By the next morning, an editor at the registry report messaged Imani directly. "We've been waiting for something like this." Selene read the message and said nothing. But inside, something settled. Not victory, not revenge, just correction. She didn't need the world to know it was her. She only needed the world to finally see him. Would you go this far, or is revenge never the answer? Comment below. And if you believe in justice served with grace, subscribe for more stories like this. The invitation never came, but that didn't stop her. The charity gala was one of the season's most talked about events, hosted at a marble-drenched ballroom in Midtown, flooded with hedge fund royalty, press darlings, and those desperate to be photographed beside both. The event's proceeds were meant to fund education initiatives in underserved regions, but most people were more invested in their seating placement and the strength of the wine list. Caius was set to deliver the keynote speech. The entire foundation had been heavily branded in partnership with his company's philanthropic arm, the same arm now under silent investigation. Selene stepped out of the black car without assistance. She didn't need anyone to open her door. The cold air bit at her skin, but she didn't flinch. Cameras lined the entrance, snapping away at power couples and brand sponsors. No one noticed her at first, not until she reached the steps. Heads began to turn. Whispers trailed behind her heels. Because while Selene's name was not on the guest list, her presence was impossible to ignore. She didn't need validation. She was the headline. A staff member near the check-in table fumbled with their tablet. "I'm sorry. Are you?" Selene didn't pause. She offered a polite smile, the kind you give someone who has no idea they're standing at the edge of something important. "No name needed," she said softly, walking past. Her dress shimmered under the chandeliers as she entered the ballroom, each step purposeful, each glance calculated. The room reacted slowly, then all at once. People turned. Gasps followed. The photographers at the back stopped clicking for a second, then surged forward, lenses ready. Selene Aurelian had arrived, uninvited, unapologetic, unbothered. It wasn't a coincidence. The dress, deep emerald silk with a low back and a side slit that cut just above the knee, was unmistakable. The same one Jelena had worn the day Selene found them in the study. It had clung to her like a secret that thought it wouldn't be caught. Selene had seen it once, hanging from Jelena's shoulder like triumph. Now, it graced Selene's figure like a statement. She had found the boutique, purchased the exact piece in her size, and tailored it precisely, no adjustments needed. It fit her like it was made for this moment, like it had been waiting for her to reclaim it. As she walked into the ballroom, the room didn't just look, it paused. The color, the silhouette, the familiarity, it stirred a silent panic among those who knew too much and said too little. From across the room, Jelena caught sight of her. It took less than a second for her smile to falter. She was mid-conversation with an editor from Lux Line Weekly, holding a champagne flute as she laughed at something forgettable. But once she saw Solène, her laugh dissolved. Her hand clutched the stem of the glass too tightly. Because she knew. And worse, she remembered. The dress was no longer hers. The moment no longer belonged to her. It never had. Caius hadn't noticed yet. He was on the opposite side of the ballroom, entertaining donors, posture polished, his face set in its usual social mode. But Jelena knew what was coming. Solène didn't even look at her. She didn't have to. She was the echo of their secret, but louder, prouder, undeniable. She didn't just wear the dress. She wore the narrative. The first flash came from the left side of the room. Then another, then a flood. The photographers hadn't been briefed on her attendance, but that didn't matter. Solène was magnetic, not because of status, but because of what her presence meant. Every lens followed her path across the ballroom like she was the center of gravity. Jelena turned her face slightly, trying to regain composure. Her smile returned, forced, thin, and visibly cracking beneath her makeup. She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, then reached for her champagne again, this time with a tremble in her wrist. Caius finally noticed when the murmurs grew into conversation. He followed the crowd's gaze. His eyes landed on the emerald silk before they found her face. The moment his brain caught up to his sight, his body stiffened. His smile faltered. The smooth cadence of his voice, mid-sentence, hitched. He didn't finish his thought. He didn't remember what he was saying. He took a step back. One breath in. His jaw clenched. Solène hadn't looked at him yet. She was busy acknowledging a Foundation board member, someone who, until tonight, had only known her as the wife who stepped away. The board member extended a hand. "Solène, I didn't know you'd be joining us." "I didn't know either," she replied lightly, until it felt necessary. The room, once filled with curated poise and practiced indifference, had shifted. Now people were whispering names. Solène, Jelena, Caius, not in admiration, in speculation. Caius tried to recover. He adjusted his cuff, smoothed his expression, but the effort only made it worse. Because the more he tried to look composed, the more obvious it became he was cornered. And the woman he underestimated was now the one controlling the air in the room. She didn't need to say a word. As the ballroom buzzed around her, Solène walked past Caius and Jelena with the grace of a woman who knew exactly where she stood. Not above them, not beneath them, beyond them. Jelena shrank behind her glass, her hand tightening around the stem until her knuckles whitened. Her lips parted like she might say something, but no sound came. She looked at Caius for direction, as if he could fix what was already unraveling under the chandeliers. But Caius was frozen. Solène didn't look at either of them. She paused by the press wall, where couples posed, sponsors smiled, and reputations were captured in pixels. Photographers, sensing an unspoken shift in hierarchy, surged toward her. They didn't ask her to move aside. They didn't ask who she was with. They asked only one thing, "Solène, may we?" She turned slightly, placing one hand on her hip, her profile framed in clean lines and calm power. The cameras lit up again, not out of obligation, but hunger. She posed, just once. No drama, no overperformance, just a soft smirk and eyes that spoke more than a public statement ever could. The smile didn't scream, "I caught you." It whispered, "I've already moved on." No confrontation, no theatrics, just presence. It was the kind of moment people don't forget, not because it was loud, but because it didn't need to be. Jelena watched, unblinking. Caius stood still, breathing through his nose, unsure whether to approach or disappear. But Solène? She turned toward the bar next, collected a glass of water, and slipped into a casual conversation with a guest who had no idea what she'd just walked past. Because sometimes the loudest move a woman can make is her silence. They wouldn't print it, not right away. But those standing near the press wall, those seasoned enough to know a moment when they saw one, felt it in the air. Solène didn't just walk into the gala. She orchestrated an atmosphere, a message without words. A young photographer, barely out of internship, stood at the back of the crowd, reviewing his shots. His lens had captured it all: Jelina's frozen smile, Caius's faltering posture, and Solene, serene as ever, framed against the marble and gold. He leaned toward the woman beside him, another shutter wielder with sharper elbows and years more experience. She planned this, didn't she? The woman didn't answer right away. She just stared at Solene's last pose on the playback screen and murmured, "Every inch of it." It wasn't about vengeance. Not really. This was strategy. Elegance wrapped in intent. And everyone who mattered saw it. PR reps whispered updates to clients. Board members glanced at their phones, noticing the photos already circulating. Donors murmured to each other, their smiles more strained than they'd been when they entered. Caius attempted to pivot, tried to approach one of his key investors. But the man's expression was now unreadable, cautious, calculating. The timing was brutal. The leaks were still unconfirmed, the investigations still unofficial, but Solene's entrance shifted something public. Not proof, but perception. And perception could ruin a man faster than fact. But Solene wasn't watching any of this unfold. She was already headed for the exit, glass still half full in her hand, her other arm grazing the satin fabric at her waist. She didn't rush. She didn't linger. She simply walked, past whispered names and strained greetings, like a woman who had nothing to fear from being seen. Because she hadn't come to be noticed. She came to be remembered. And she was. But the real twist wasn't the scandal. It was who watched her from across the room. 3 days after the gala, Solene sat by the window in her apartment, not looking at the headlines, not watching the buzz she'd triggered. The world was catching up to a truth she'd already accepted. But inside, she was quiet, not tired, just emptied, not in pain, just still. She hadn't expected to hear from anyone, especially not someone from the life she'd nearly forgotten. The one before all the strategy decks and investor dinners, before the headlines and betrayals. That's why the name caught her off guard when it popped up on her phone. Elion Trescott. She hadn't thought about him in years. Back when she was still showing her early collections in stripped-down, brick-walled exhibits and pouring all her rent money into framing costs, he was one of the first patrons to invest in her vision, not because it was profitable, but because it was honest. He was known in the art world as the quiet backer, the man who donated anonymously to struggling programs, who refused to put his name on buildings, who preferred to sit in the back row at openings and observe, not perform. He had once purchased a sculpture of hers called Inheritance, and after the show, he sent a handwritten note. "You don't just make art, you translate grief into form." That's a kind of generosity. They hadn't spoken since. So when his name appeared on her screen, with a message she wasn't expecting, Solene hesitated before opening it. But she did, and what she read made her sit back, heart still, but softened. "Strength looks good on you, but I remember when your smile was softer. If you ever want to talk about art again, I'm here." There was no flirtation, no agenda, just remembrance, and maybe a door. The message lingered in her mind longer than she expected. Solene reread it twice, once for meaning, once for weight. There was something about the wording that disarmed her. Not pity, not admiration dressed as flattery. It was memory. Personal, earnest. A man recalling not just who she'd been, but how she'd felt back then. "Strength looks good on you, but I remember when your smile was softer." The second half clung to her, because it was true. She had grown sharper over the years, polished in ways that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with self-preservation. She'd become skilled at reading rooms, managing optics, holding her chin high while her soul tucked itself quietly away. Softness had become a luxury, or maybe a risk. And now, here was a man who wasn't chasing her current headline, but referencing a quieter version of her, someone she barely remembered herself. She didn't respond right away, not out of hesitation, but out of reverence. The message didn't require a reaction, it invited one. That night, she didn't scroll social media. She didn't check the comments under news articles. She pulled out her journal, one she hadn't opened since before the wedding, and wrote down only one line: "Who was I when I didn't have to prove anything?" The next morning, she replied to Elion, "Coffee, somewhere quiet, just to talk, no signature, no flourish." It didn't need it. Because sometimes what you say isn't as important as why you finally say yes. The cafe was tucked into a quiet corner of Soho, wooden chairs, soft light, the kind of place where conversations didn't echo. She arrived 5 minutes early, unsure if that meant anything anymore. She wore no makeup beyond tinted balm, and her coat was thrifted wool, not curated. Just hers. Elion was already there. He stood when she entered, an old-school courtesy she hadn't seen in years. No photographers, no curious glances, just a man at a corner table who once believed in her work before her name meant clicks or scandal. His smile was warm but restrained. Solène, Elion. They didn't hug. They sat. At first, there were pauses, not awkward ones, just spaces between words. He didn't comment on the news, didn't ask questions he already knew the answers to. He let her lead. "How long have you been back in the city?" she asked. "A few months. Consulting with an art fund that actually wants to back creators instead of trends." He smiled faintly. "Which is rare these days." She nodded. "I remember when that felt possible. It still is. For the right people." He looked at her when he said it, not through her, not around her, at her. She stirred her tea. "I'm not who I used to be." "Good," he said. "You were never meant to stay in one version." They didn't talk about Caius, not directly. But when she glanced down at her hands, Elion noticed the absence of her ring. He didn't comment, just adjusted the sleeve of his coat and let the silence rest between them like something sacred. They stayed like that for almost 2 hours. No strategy, no seduction, just presence. And for the first time in a long while, Solène didn't feel watched. She felt seen. It started with a pencil. After that first coffee with Elion, Solène returned home and opened a drawer she hadn't touched in nearly a year. Inside was a box of charcoal sticks, a worn sketchbook with corners curled from neglect, and a single graphite pencil she used to keep behind her ear like a habit. She didn't force a return. She didn't set an intention. She just sat in the kitchen, opened the book to a blank page, and let her hand move. The lines were crooked at first, uncertain, but soon shapes emerged. Rough outlines of people not meant to be recognized, only felt. They were half faces, broken frames, hands that reached but never held. It wasn't pretty, but it was honest, and it was hers. Each morning after, she drew. Not for a show, not for acclaim, for silence, for grounding, for self. She also began journaling again. Not structured entries, just fragments. Thoughts she didn't say out loud, confessions that had nowhere to go. Some were questions. Some were answers she had buried beneath years of compromise. I don't want to be known for what I survived. What does softness mean when you've had to armor yourself for years? What if peace is not something you find, but something you return to? Days turned into a rhythm. Coffee in the morning, sketches in the afternoon, a walk through a museum when she didn't want to be indoors. The world began to feel less sharp around the edges. And Elion. He didn't rush her. He didn't ask for progress updates. He sent her articles about upcoming exhibits. He shared songs without lyrics. He gave space instead of suggestions. In giving her room, he gave her back something far more precious than support. He gave her permission to belong to herself again. The press didn't break the story. The internet did. The leaked files, once whispered about on niche finance blogs, began surfacing in larger spaces, shared across digital forums, dissected by freelance auditors and picked apart by angry donors who had once believed in Caius Aurelian's pristine brand of philanthropy. It wasn't the affair that brought him down. It was the receipts. Social media swarmed. Anonymous employees stepped forward with stories that mirrored the documents. Delayed payments, pressure to silence concerns, misreported donation metrics. One whistleblower released a video explaining how she was coached to present fake impact data during a televised charity event. Caius's name trended for 6 days straight, not because of gossip, because of fraud. The backlash was swift, and unlike anything his carefully curated image had ever withstood. Celebrities who once praised his eco-ventures deleted their collaborations. Partner foundations issued statements of deep concern. A podcast titled Beneath the Halo dedicated 3 full episodes to unpacking his empire's cracks. But the real damage came from inside. His board, a tight-knit group of investors and advisors, met behind closed doors in an emergency session. Leaks from that meeting revealed raised voices, risk assessments, and urgent talks of liability shielding. 3 days later, the official statement dropped. Effective immediately, Caius Aurelian has voluntarily stepped down as CEO and chairman. The board remains committed to transparency and ethical rebuilding. There was no press conference, no farewell speech. Just one final photo of him walking out of the office building, flanked by legal counsel, avoiding the cameras. It wasn't exile. It was erosion, quiet, steady, and inescapable. And for the first time in his career, he couldn't control the story. Jelena had always known how to ride a wave: fashion features, social events, corporate press kits that praised her efficiency and poise. For years, she had positioned herself as more than a secretary. She was the gatekeeper, the woman beside the man, not quite visible, but always well placed in the periphery of success, until the wave turned. When the files leaked and Soline's silent exit became a viral moment, people began asking the inevitable question, who else knew? Jelena's name trailed just behind Caius. She was never publicly accused, never formally investigated, but her presence in boardrooms and her proximity to company decisions made her complicit in the court of perception. Her modeling agency, previously eager to book her for wellness campaigns and corporate wellness brands, went dark. Emails went unanswered. Upcoming shoots were postponed. One brand, subtly but effectively, removed her from an upcoming campaign and replaced her with a rising advocate for ethical labor. Worse than the cancellation was the silence. No PR teams rushed to defend her. No influencers posted supportive hashtags. The same magazines that once praised her chic efficiency quietly unfollowed her across platforms. Even Caius, once the man who pressed her against oak desks and whispered future plans, stopped returning her messages. He was too busy untangling his empire. And she was no longer useful. For Jelena, the fall wasn't dramatic. It was erasure. Bit by bit, her image dissolved from the spaces she had once carefully arranged for herself. And for the first time she realized, being adjacent to power is only beautiful when that power is untouchable. The media wanted her. After the gala, after the headlines, after Caius stepped down, reporters circled like moths to the quietest flame. They didn't just want quotes, they wanted a narrative, a victim, a scorned wife with a perfectly timed comeback. But Selene gave them nothing. No tell-all, no podcast guest spot, no cryptic Instagram captions. She declined every request, politely but without apology. Even Imani, who had helped her ignite the match, respected the boundary. "What's your next move?" Imani had asked her gently over lunch. Selene stirred her tea and replied, "I already made it. Everything else is just noise." She wasn't trying to reclaim an image. She wasn't campaigning for sympathy or riding the shockwave of exposure. Her silence wasn't retreat, it was authorship. Let them guess. Let them wonder how much she knew, when she knew it, how she planned it. Let them debate whether the dress at the gala was a coincidence or a statement. The truth? Selene didn't owe anyone the inside of her healing. She spent her days sketching, reading, and walking through museums where no one looked twice at her. She sent 2 small donations to women's legal defense funds, anonymously. She met Elion for coffee once a week, sometimes twice. But they didn't talk about the past. They didn't need to. In refusing to speak, she became louder than ever. Because some stories don't need to be retold. They just need to be witnessed. And Solane had already done what most people never manage. She told the truth once, and then walked away before the applause. Now that it wasn't, she was just another name people didn't want associated with their brand. It had rained earlier. light and steady, the kind of rain that makes everything feel cleaner, quieter. The pavement still shimmered under the streetlights, reflecting amber and gold. Selene and Elion walked side by side, coats closed but unhurried. It wasn't late, but the city around them had dimmed to a hush that made every step feel intentional. They'd just left a small exhibit tucked into a community art space in the East Village. The walls had been filled with works from survivors, pieces made from scraps, losses, and found objects. Selene hadn't said much while they were inside. She didn't need to. Elion had simply stood beside her, letting the pieces speak to them both. Now, as they walked, the silence between them wasn't heavy. It was reflective, intimate, in the way that doesn't need touching. She turned a corner, and he matched her pace. "You always walk this way home?" he asked, glancing toward the dim stretch of brownstones ahead. "Only when I've seen something that reminds me why I started," she said. "It resets me." He nodded, as if he understood completely. They reached her building. She paused at the steps, pulling her keys from her coat pocket, then turned to face him. For a moment, neither spoke. There was no rush to fill the air, just quiet acknowledgement of everything, the months behind them, the changes, the restraint. "Thank you for tonight," she said. "And not just tonight. You don't have to thank me," he replied. "I know," she said softly. "But I want to." He didn't offer to come inside. He didn't reach for her hand. He didn't lean in. He stayed where he was, a man who understood that sometimes the most sacred thing you can offer a woman is patience. She hesitated before turning the key. Her hand hovered over the lock, the weight of the evening, not just tonight, but every night she had carried alone, sitting in her chest. She looked back at Elion. His expression didn't press her for more, but something in the way he waited, not for access but for permission, disarmed her. She lowered her hand, turned fully to face him, and asked quietly, "Do you think I'm broken now?" She wasn't sure why the question left her lips. Maybe it had been waiting at the back of her throat for too long. It wasn't performative. It wasn't rhetorical. It was raw, honest, a truth she didn't know she still feared. He didn't rush to answer. He didn't panic at her vulnerability or try to fix it with distraction. Instead, he looked directly into her eyes. "I think," he said, his voice low but certain, "you were shattered. And you did what most people never figure out how to do." She tilted her head, brows gently knit. "You didn't hide the cracks," he continued. "You held them, you examined them, and now—" He paused, stepping just a little closer, but not enough to crowd her. "Now, you're mosaic." She blinked. "Mosaic." He nodded. "Shattered once, but put back together with gold." Selene felt something shift inside her chest, not something breaking, but something rearranging, softening. The wind rustled down the block. A car passed. The city moved on, but that moment stayed, not because he saw her strength, but because he saw her softness and didn't mistake it for weakness. Selene let the silence breathe between them, not because she was unsure, because it was the first time in a long time she felt safe enough to let her silence mean something. She looked up at Elion, not for affirmation, but for acknowledgement. Her heart wasn't racing. It was steady, the kind of steady that comes after storms, when the air smells clean and the noise has settled. "I used to think," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "that being strong meant never falling apart in front of anyone. That love was earned by holding everything together, even when I was unraveling inside." Elion didn't respond. He didn't offer a counterpoint or a romanticized version of strength. He just stayed, fully present, letting her finish. "But now," she said, eyes glistening, "I think real strength is knowing when to let someone see you, before you're fully whole." He nodded once, slowly. Then, without stepping forward, without reaching for her waist or brushing her hair aside, he said, "You don't owe me the pieces." She swallowed, her chest tightening, not with hurt, but release. "And I'm not here to glue anything back together," he added. "I just want to be someone you can breathe next to." That was it. No kiss, no dramatic embrace, no swelling music. Just two people at the edge of something real, choosing stillness over spectacle. Selena smiled. It was small, but it was the kind of smile that belonged entirely to her. And in that moment, she understood. Love didn't have to arrive like thunder. Sometimes, it waits patiently at your doorstep and simply asks to be let in. Do you believe in second chances after betrayal? Would you trust again? Tell us in the comments, and subscribe if this one touched you deeply. Selene watched as Elion turned to leave, his steps calm, unhurried. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. She stood at the door for a long moment after, her hand resting gently on the doorknob, her breath deep and even. The urge to cry didn't come, not because she wasn't emotional, but because the grief had finally taken on a different shape. It no longer demanded to be spilled. It had been witnessed. She stepped inside and locked the door behind her, not out of fear, but closure. The apartment was dim and still, the air holding the scent of lavender from the candle she'd lit that morning. She slipped off her shoes and walked barefoot to the kitchen, where her journal waited on the counter beside a half-finished sketch. She opened it. Tonight's entry wasn't long. It didn't need to be. Just a single line. I am not what broke me. I am what I chose to become after. She stared at the words, then closed the journal with quiet finality. In the living room, one of her earliest sculptures, a small clay piece titled Flicker, sat on the windowsill. She hadn't touched it in years. Tonight, she picked it up, turned it in her hands, and smiled at the uneven edges. It wasn't perfect. That's why it still meant something. Selene didn't need headlines anymore. She didn't need the world to know she had won. She didn't even need Caius to regret it. She had made peace with the ruin, and in doing so, rebuilt something far more beautiful. Not flawless, but whole. And in the quiet of that evening, surrounded by art and absence, she realized she hadn't just survived. She had returned to herself. The gallery buzzed with soft conversation and the low hum of jazz drifting from a corner speaker. Selene stood near the back wall, not as a guest, but as the artist again, for the first time in years. Her name, in plain serif letters above the title Inheritance Reimagined, hung cleanly above her new work. The space was filled, but not crowded, thoughtfully lit, curated with intention. Just like the art itself, pieces layered with contradiction, broken ceramics bonded with gold. Ink sketches of open windows, abstract silhouettes stitched over canvases of burned fabric. Each piece told the truth without screaming it. She moved through the crowd, gracious, calm, no longer watching for anyone's approval. She wasn't selling herself tonight. She was offering a glimpse. Near the refreshments, Elion waited. He didn't hover or position himself to be noticed. He simply stood, a gentle presence in a charcoal coat, hands in his pockets, watching her from across the room with quiet pride. When their eyes finally met, she didn't rush toward him. She just smiled, and he smiled back. There was nothing to prove anymore. The storm had passed. Tonight wasn't about healing. It was about what happens after. They left just after 10, not because the evening had grown dull, but because it had given them all it needed to. Selene thanked the gallery owner, nodded to a few remaining guests, then met Elion by the door. He didn't offer his arm. She didn't need it. The night air greeted them with a crispness that hinted at the end of the season. Streetlights flickered overhead, casting soft gold across the pavement as their steps fell into rhythm. They didn't speak at first. There was no need to fill the air. He glanced at her once, taking in the way her hair caught the light, the quiet in her shoulders, the grace in how she walked. She looked ahead, then toward him. No smile, just a knowing look. Mutual awareness, mutual peace. When they passed the corner flower stall, she paused. It had closed for the night, but the leftover scent of roses still lingered. Elion noticed, but didn't comment. He simply matched her pace as she moved again. The silence between them wasn't distance. It was comfort, a different kind of closeness, one that didn't rely on words or performance. Just two people walking side by side, carrying nothing but presence. They reached her door, the same one he'd walked her to before, but tonight was different. There was no uncertainty between them, No lingering questions, just a quiet stillness, full of meaning. Selene turned to face him beneath the soft porch light. Her coat hung open, revealing the navy silk blouse she'd worn during the show, now slightly wrinkled from the evening. She looked up at him with that same calm she'd carried all night, unshaken, unperformed, present. Elion met her gaze. He didn't ask. He didn't move too soon. He waited. Because he understood that the kind of woman who rebuilt herself deserves to choose the moment. She stepped closer, just slightly, and tipped her chin upward, not as an invitation, but as a confirmation. She was ready. And then, it happened. A kiss, not rushed, not bold, not hungry, soft, grounded. A kiss that didn't promise to erase the past or pretend the pain hadn't existed. A kiss that said, "I see you." A kiss that knew the difference between rescue and reverence. When they parted, neither spoke. They didn't need to. Because when something is real, it doesn't beg to be named right away. It just settles, warm, steady, and understood. It arrived quietly, just like the first ripple of the storm months ago. An email, polite, measured, from a respected independent outlet known for long-form features and slow journalism. No tabloids, no gossip-hungry headlines. Just a single-line subject, a story only you can tell. Selene read it twice. She hadn't responded to any press in weeks. She had turned down panel offers, cover shoots, even a documentary pitch. The frenzy had slowed, but curiosity lingered. Everyone still wanted her to speak. On the scandal, the silence, the strategy. But this message was different. The journalist didn't want her version of Caius. She wanted her voice. We're doing a series on women who choose quiet power in the aftermath of public betrayal. We're not asking for names. We're asking for truths. Yours. Selene sat with it for 2 days, and on the third she responded, "Yes, but I won't speak about him. I'll speak about what it means to rebuild yourself when the world expects you to collapse." There was no negotiation. That was the condition. If they wanted her story, they'd have to leave the scandal behind and step into something deeper. Not retribution. Reclamation. The interview took place in a quiet studio with no makeup team, no staged backdrops, just 2 chairs, a glass of water, and a single microphone. Selene arrived with her hair pulled back, a cream blouse tucked into soft linen trousers, and a journal tucked beneath her arm. There was no entourage, no script, just a woman ready to speak, not to defend, but to define. The interviewer asked gently, "When did you first know you were losing yourself?" Selene paused. "When I stopped hearing myself think." She didn't speak about the affair. She didn't list what was taken or recount what was exposed. She spoke instead about quiet erasure, the kind that doesn't come with violence, but with slow forgetting, the kind where you smile through rooms you no longer belong to, where your opinions shrink to make others comfortable, where your silence is mistaken for serenity. "People ask how I stayed so composed," she said, folding her hands. "But they never ask what it costs to maintain composure while your voice goes missing." Then she said something that would be quoted for weeks after the segment aired. "Healing doesn't come from being loud. It comes from being honest, even if the first person you tell the truth to is yourself." When the interview ended, she didn't linger. She thanked the crew, walked out without fanfare, and returned to her studio. Because the story wasn't in the interview, it was in what came next. The new exhibit opened on a rainy afternoon, fitting, almost poetic. No velvet ropes, no influencers. Just a clean white space in a downtown gallery, and a list of guests curated for their connection to the work, not the noise. Selene arrived early, hours before the doors opened. Alone. She wore black, simple, unstructured, and carried a single piece wrapped in soft cloth. It wasn't on the catalogue list. It hadn't been posted to her social feed. This piece wasn't for buzz. It was for closure. She unwrapped it carefully. It was small, only 12 inches high, a human silhouette fractured through the middle, but fused with thin lines of gold. Each break, each line, hand-laid. The title engraved discreetly at the base, Mosaic. The gallery assistant approached quietly. Where do you want it? Celine turned toward a narrow pedestal near the far wall. Light spilled in from a side window, soft and imperfect, catching every golden seam in the sculpture. Here, she said. No plaque, no description, just the piece. And just before the guests arrived, before even Elion walked in, she stepped back, hands folded in front of her, and looked at what she had made. This wasn't about art as survival. This was art as reminder. That wholeness isn't about being untouched. It's about choosing to honor the fractures. As the gallery filled with soft conversation and slow footsteps, Celine stepped into the back room for a moment alone. She didn't need to be seen. She needed to remember. She stood before a mirror, not to adjust her blouse, not to check her reflection, just to look at herself, at the woman who had once doubted she could stand through what came. The one who did more than stand. She chose to rebuild. The voiceover was recorded later, for the closing feature of the same series that had aired her interview, but the words had been living inside her long before the microphone was ever turned on. Healing didn't start the day I walked out. There was a pause in her voice, the kind that tells you what's coming isn't scripted. It started the day I turned back toward myself, a breath, when I stopped waiting for someone to see me, when I stopped needing permission to matter. That's when the healing began. As those words played across a final montage, the sculpture, the guests, the quiet way Elion stood at the edge of the room watching her without ownership. Everything made sense. No fireworks, no grand finale, just presence and peace. If this story made you feel something, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to Midnight Story Vault because healing starts with storytelling.